Today on Fairy Fortunes, we're going to be exploring intuitive, inductive, and interpretive divination and explore the pros and cons of each.
If you would like to learn about fairy folklore, delve into modern fairy faith spirituality, and explore fun and fanciful fairy-themed events, please subscribe to Fairy Fortunes for new videos every Friday.
Hello my fair friends, I'm Ruby Ruse and this is Fairy Fortunes. This YouTube channel was based on the name of my divination system, so as you can imagine I am extremely passionate about divination. I think that if you are on an explorative journey on alternative spirituality and exploring a new magical practice and system, I think divination is a very basic magical practice to begin with. I also think that if you are already an advanced magical practitioner, exploring one of these different types and categories of divination can enhance and develop your magical skills even further. According to Merriam-Webster, the definition of divination is an art or practice that seeks to foresee or foretell future events or discover hidden knowledge, usually by the interpretation of omens, by the aid of supernatural powers. I think that divination taps into the existential human experience and gives us insight on the present that we're experiencing, the possible future, and even can give us insight on the past as well. What I think the primary purpose of divination is to expose those patterns that are flowing through our lives and help us analyze them and make some very conscious decisions about them. The oldest surviving record that we have on divination and its categories was written by a 1st century Roman politician by the name of Cicero. Now I will be honest with you and let you know that I have not personally read his treatise on divination. The modern categories of divinations that were based on that treatise, though, are inductive divination, intuitive divination, and interpretive divination. The goal of intuitive divination is to communicate with third-party entities and employs generally a trance-like state. Inductive divination focuses on a set of very fixed symbols, and the theory is that all diviners would then be able to come to the same conclusion regarding those fixed symbols. Interpretive divination is the most prevalent and common, I think, and interpretive divination focuses on a set of abstract symbols and requires a skilled practitioner to interpret those symbols. But in order to really grasp the differences between each of the divination systems, I thought it would be easier to articulate if I showed you some of the examples that I currently possess in each of those 3 categories. So as you can see, I have a large selection of different types of divination symbols set out for you here today. So examples of intuitive divination include things like crystal balls. This can also include scrying tools and things like magic mirrors. Intuitive divination also includes things like pendulums and also the Ouija board. Now, before we go on to the other categories, I just want to make a note about Ouija boards and just let you know that I did make a video that was expressly devoted to the history of the Ouija board, and I highly recommend that you watch that because the Ouija board gets a bad rap because it has been the victim of pop culture. Now, a lot of people, while they're against the Ouija board, are very pro-pendulum. And I have a lot of people that recommend the pendulum to new aspiring magicians and diviners. But I just want to point something out. Both the pendulum and the Ouija board utilize intuitive divination, meaning that it requires a third party. Now, with a pendulum, usually what people think they're doing with a pendulum is they are using the pendulum sometimes to contact their own self, their higher self, if you will, or something like a spirit guide or a guardian angel. And you certainly can use a pendulum to do that. You can also use a Ouija board to have a conversation with yourself as well. A pendulum, this particular pendulum that I have, actually is devoted to a particular fairy spirit that lives in my own home. And this pendulum has been devoted to her, and she is the only spirit that is authorized to use this particular pendulum. She has claimed it for herself. But with pendulums and Ouija boards, all different kinds of spirits can utilize these tools. And I just want to point out that if you take a pendulum and you hold it over the Ouija board without the planchette, the pendulum becomes the planchette. So these two things are very much the same thing. So I do encourage you, after you're done watching this video, to watch that video on the Ouija board. I will have it linked in the description down below, and I will also have it in a card above my head, so please check that video out. With mediumship, you don't have any tool with you at all. You simply channel the being yourself with that. Moving on to inductive divination now, we have things like astrology and numerology. It also includes things like Urim and Thummim. This divination system is actually expressly mentioned in the Bible. So if you are a Christian magical practitioner, this would probably be a good system for you to experiment with. However, not a lot of information survives about Urim and Thummim. I think how this system was used, and this is how I've been experimenting with it, is that these two stones were thrown on the ground. The Urim, the white stone, was used to reflect the will of God. The black stone was the opposite, or perhaps man's understanding of what man wanted to do. What I think this was is that when the Urim was higher than the Thummim, the answer was yes. If it was reversed, the answer was no. Now, it should be noted that there was also a possibility of maybe, and I think that when the Urim was unable to produce an answer, it was when both stones were predominantly on the same plane as one another. So the Urim and Thummim is a very simple type of inductive divination. Now, a modern take on inductive divination is the magic 8-ball. It's true. Now, I know that this device is sold as a novelty item. If you go and you watch the video I made on the Ouija board, you will learn that the Ouija board was a product of the United States of America and was patented as a novelty item as well. Just because it's patented as a novelty item does not mean that it's not a magical item, and it does not mean that it doesn't work. The magic 8-ball is actually the first divination system that I personally started using when I was a very little girl, and it does work. This is a form of inductive divination, because the whole premise of a magic 8-ball is that you ask it a question, and then whatever comes up in the screen is your answer. The symbols are very fixed. It's going to give you a very clear answer, and every person is going to be able to use this and get similar results to it. So this is a form of inductive divination because it is a system of fixed symbols. And then the final category of divination, of course, is interpretive divination. So with interpretive divination, this is a very wide range. It's also the most common form of divination systems that you will find. These systems include things like the runes. It includes things like geomancy. It also includes card systems like the tarot cards that I showed in another video. And it also includes, with that, all types of card systems, even ones that are not common or were created by individual practitioners, just like the fairy fortune cards that I designed myself. So most divination systems that you are going to encounter are probably going to fit into that interpretive category. So let's talk about the pros and cons of divination systems so that you might be able to think about these and perhaps begin experimenting with divination for yourself. With intuitive divination, that offers a great deal of flexibility because there are absolutely no symbols that you need to memorize. It is simply an experience. And within that experience, a great deal of the time, it is a shared experience. You are often contacting a very specific being. For example, I mentioned my pendulum has been claimed and is devoted to a very particular fairy spirit, and she uses this to communicate with me. With this particular crystal ball that I have, crystals are fascinating beings. They are rocks that many scientists believe are growing life forms in and of themselves. So they just grow at a very, very slow rate that is imperceptible to humanity. So crystals are fascinating. So with me and this particular crystal ball, when I use this crystal ball, I'm actually interacting with the crystal itself, and we're having a conversation between me and the crystal world. So this is a fascinating concept when you use a crystal ball. When I use my magic mirror, I'm usually contacting a variety of different spiritual entities. You can use a magic mirror for oracle work, and different beings will help you see different types of oracles and signs and different things. But as I said, intuitive divination really is a shared experience. And with that shared experience, it really provides you an opportunity to build relationships. You can use a Ouija board to communicate with fairy spirits that maybe live in your area. They can use this board to speak with you, because keep in mind that the fairy spirits have their own languages, so that they can use this as a translation device so that the two of you can communicate together. And with communicating with these spirits, you can build relationships and process knowledge and learn and grow from each other. So that is a really big pro to using intuitive divination. However, as I said, intuitive divination really depends on a third-party element. Even if you're using a pendulum to communicate with your higher self, here's a different pendulum that I have. If you're using a pendulum to communicate with your higher self or your spirit guide, even you yourself might not be in a place where you feel like communicating, or maybe you're confused and you just can't get through to yourself. Like, that happens all the time, is that we know it's good for us and we ignore ourselves. So with fairy spirits, you know, especially with the fairy spirit that this one has been devoted to, she might have gone on vacation. She might not be available to talk. They're not at our beck and call. They have their own needs and their own wants and desires. So with intuitive divination, the experience you have is very much dependent on the other party involved. Now, the Ouija, I mentioned that the Ouija board has gotten a very bad rap for summoning demons. I have many opinions on summoning demons. Yeah. And I think it's possible, sure, you could communicate with a demon on a Ouija board, but it depends on what you mean by demon, because demon is a word that means many different things in many different contexts and many different cultures. So, sure, I suppose you could contact a demon, but what do you mean by demon? But yes, I mean, you can contact entities on a Ouija board and with a pendulum and with a scrying tool or a crystal ball that can be malevolent, that can be angry, that can be wanting to scare you. That is a possibility. I disagree that intuitive divination is a dangerous form of divination. I disagree with that entirely. I think that there are limits to what magical tools can do in this universe, and I do not believe that you can be harmed by a Ouija board. I think that humanity itself offers 1,000 times more dangers than any of these tools that I have here for you today. The final problem with intuitive divination, though, beyond these, people trying to scare you, oh, it's so dangerous. I don't think it's dangerous. But with intuitive divination, the problem with it is that you really have to get out of your own way. There's this idea that we have that mediums are a very special brand of person. A medium might have been born that way. I do think that there is a little bit of truth in that. However, I believe that magic is a birthright. It is a part of our existence. And I believe that if you want to experiment with mediumship, I encourage you to do so, because I do think that is a skill that is not beyond your abilities. Now, obviously, there's going to be those very special humans that are very gifted mediums and can do it very easily, but we find that in any type of skill. There are people, obviously, Rihanna, for example, is an amazing vocalist, and she had these abilities when she was very young. However, she still had to practice and define her craft for herself. So obviously, yes, there is some genetics and some things that go into developing a skill, but it is not beyond you. You can practice mediumship. However, with that said, you have to get out of your own way, because the most difficult thing that you will have to overcome is you yourself telling yourself that you are making it up and it's all your imagination. Here's the thing to keep in mind with magic. Magic is fueled by imagination. In order to manifest anything in this world, you have to imagine it first. So magic is imagination. So just because you imagined it does not mean it's not valuable. So keep that in mind. So that is the hardest thing to overcome in experimenting with intuitive divination. Now, with inductive divination, the pros with this is it gives you a very specific answer. Something like Urim and Thummim, for example, gives you a very clear yes, no, and sometimes a maybe answer. So that's one of the advantages of using inductive divination. It's very clear cut. And inductive divination is also one of the most enduring forms of divination. Astrology and numerology have been around for centuries and are still in practice to this day. So it is one of the most enduring forms of divination systems. Some of the cons involved with inductive divination is, for example, the processes of numerology and astrology, like I said, that have been around for centuries, is that you do have to educate yourself and spend a fair amount of time doing research so that you can interpret those fixed systems consistently and well. So that is one of the cons, is that you really have to put in a lot of devoted focus and time to those systems. That said, Urim and Thummim and the Magic 8 Ball, you don't need any time at all for those. It just simply is. With Urim and Thummim and the Magic 8 Ball, though, the cons of those is that they give a very flat yes or no, or very specific answers within the Magic 8 Ball. And with that, you don't really have an opportunity to explore why the answer is that answer, or how you're going to get to that answer. So there's not a lot of subconscious substance that goes into some of the more simple forms of inductive divination. Another con about inductive divination is that it is far from the consistency that the theory leads us to believe. In theory, every astrologer is going to be able to look at the planets in the sky and be able to give exactly the same answer. And as we can see, that isn't necessarily the case. For example, if we read our horoscopes in different publications, different astrologers are going to give us different suggestions and different points of focus. So with inductive divination, we still have to have an open and yet discerning mind when we approach divination. With interpretive divination, one of the best things about it is that there is so many forms of interpretive divination to choose from. And you can even do what I did and create your own system, which I actually highly recommend. I have found that with my fairy fortune systems, my divination skills and capabilities are very, very high and successful with my own divination system. So if you have been considering designing your own divination system, I highly, highly recommend that you sit down and actually do it, because I think you will be vastly rewarded by doing so. There are also numerous resources available on interpretive divination. For example, most divination systems, whether it be a set of cards like the tarot or the fairy fortune cards, even runes, come with what's called the little white book, which gives you a quick snapshot of what each of the cards mean, or what each of the runes mean. So usually you get a little note book with your interpretive divination system, but there are also a ton of publications available on interpretive divination systems, especially the most common ones. I talked about this book once before in a tarot reading that I did on the Fairy Fortunes YouTube channel. This particular book, The Choice-Centered Tarot, I really feel strongly works with any type of tarot deck you want to use. And in addition to books, there are numerous blogs and YouTube channels and even social media groups that focus on very specific forms of interpretive divination systems. So there are a lot of resources available on interpretive divination. The problem, though, with having so many resources available is that you are more easily able to encounter people who are going to disagree with your interpretation of your system. And that can be very problematic, because if you are, for example, in a social media group where you're trading information and helping each other interpret meanings and cards and symbols and that kind of thing, you may start to doubt your abilities. So that can be a definite negative when it comes to using interpretive divination systems, especially if you're using a common system like tarot or the runes, where you're going to encounter a lot of people who are going to believe that they know more than you do. If you want to start using an interpretive form of divination, you really have to rely on your own intuition. It's very, very important that you maintain that self-knowing. It's great to learn from other people's experience, but you do really have to keep track of your own intuition, which can be very difficult to do on a very well-known form of divination. The other problem that you can encounter with interpretive divination systems is that those white book meanings can become very restrictive and they can interfere with that intuition that I said was so vitally important to divination. For example, once when I was at a festival giving a fairy fortune reading, the card Conuncio the Centaur came up in a position which related to people in the person's life that I was reading for. And my fairy fortunes have very specific meanings that I actually give to each person I read. I sing them a little song to interpret the card for them. Conuncio Centaur is wild, capricious yet you be beguiled. Reverse and unite, converse in a right, his friendship you'll want reconciled. So as you can imagine, I meant for Conuncio the Centaur to refer to friendship and balance. But when it came up for this particular person, I had a strong feeling that there was an association with alcoholism. Now, with centaurs, there are many stories from mythology about centaurs and how dangerous it is when they consume alcohol. And so I had to disregard that very specific meaning that I personally had written for the card. Because when I asked her about alcoholism in her family, we had a conversation about that issue in her life and how she could perhaps navigate through that concerning the people surrounding her at that time and in relationship to the issue we were discussing. And we never would have had that very important conversation that she really needed to talk about had I ignored my intuition and gone with the friendship meaning of this card. So that is something that you do have to keep in mind with interpretive divination. That is a con in association with that. So were you surprised by some of these categories of divination? And also, I'm very curious to know if there is a divination system that you would be interested in exploring more. Do let me know in the comments down below. And with that, have a fairyful day.